Anna, Dung, Claire, Daniel, Margaret, Robert, Evelyn, Kevin, Brooke, Hatcher, Nora, Philip, Audrey, Lacey, Teresa Serrano, Jim, Gerald, Becca, Reyes, Kyle, Hollister, Okafor, Arthur Vance, Sandy, Wilson, Iris, Warren, Chandra, Patterson, Leah, Jonah, Eli, Dana, Marcus, Harold Weston, Warner, Vivian, Garrett, Thomas, Beth, Nanvaing, Tufanit, Ani, Mare, Narrator 29 2 and Ats 9 2, and Hat Try Scott, Buv, Father, Mummamoo, Mums, and Mother, Lewin, Witherwo, Anastakai's Father, Mother, Buv, Mubbamoo, Maman's Father, Mabear, Aldridge, Louing, Tufanats Vak, the Bara Mr. Aldridge, the Wenats Vav, the Pub, Anthony, Punapan, Pun of the Finch, Kuingle Ray. The morning my parents filed the lawsuit, I was making coffee, my phone buzzing on the counter. A text from my uncle, my dad's younger brother, and it said 3 words, check your email. I didn't even put the mug down. I just stood there reading the subject line twice. Notice of civil claim, filed in the Superior Court of Riverside County. I set the mug down very slowly, the way you do when your hands suddenly don't feel like yours anymore. They were suing me for the house. Not just the house, the land, the storage unit behind it, the half-acre of dry scrub that nobody had ever done anything with. All of it. My grandfather's property, the one he'd transferred to me 4 years earlier, the one I'd been paying for, maintaining, carrying. They wanted it back. And they'd hired a lawyer to get it. My mother called 11 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Then my dad called. Then my brother Scott, which surprised me because Scott and I hadn't spoken properly in almost a year. I let all of them go. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. It just seemed like the right place. And I read the filing twice, start to finish. They were claiming I had pressured my grandfather into signing, that he'd been confused, that the transfer was invalid. My grandfather had been 81 years old, sharp as anyone I'd ever met, and he'd signed those papers with his own hand at a title company in Hemet, California, with 2 witnesses and a notary present. But here we were. I should back up, because the story doesn't make sense without the years before it, and those years are the part that still sits heavy in me even now. My grandfather bought that property in the late 70s. Small house, decent bones, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a back porch he'd screened in himself. He lived alone in it since my grandmother passed in 2009. My parents lived 40 minutes away, and for a long time that was fine. They'd visit, bring groceries, check on things. Then my grandfather had a fall in 2018. Nothing catastrophic. He was back on his feet in 3 weeks. But it scared everyone, and suddenly the property became a conversation. Who would take over? Who would manage it? Who would be responsible? My parents volunteered immediately. For about 6 months they handled it, paid the property taxes, arranged for a handyman when the water heater failed, drove over on weekends. Then they stopped. Not all at once. It was gradual, the way these things always are. First they missed a payment and my grandfather covered it. Then the handyman stopped getting called. Then the visits got shorter, further apart. My dad had his own financial stuff going on. I won't get into all of it, but there were some bad business decisions, some debt that had gotten away from him, and carrying an extra property wasn't something he could do without it costing him. My grandfather called me in February of 2020. I was 26. I was living in an apartment in San Diego and working in accounts payable for a logistics company. He asked me, calmly and without drama, if I would consider taking the property. Not buying it. He wanted to transfer it. He said he'd talked to a real estate attorney. He said he'd thought about it for a long time. He said he trusted me to carry it the right way. I said yes. We did everything correctly. The attorney drafted the transfer deed. My grandfather reviewed it. We sat at a table together, him and me and the attorney and the notary, and he signed every page. He knew exactly what he was doing. He joked about it, something about how at least one person in the family read the fine print. My parents found out 3 days later. My mother cried. My dad didn't speak to me for 2 months. Scott sent me a long text about how I blindsided the family, how I'd gone behind everyone's backs, how this was exactly the kind of thing that tore families apart. I read that text probably 10 times. Then I got to work. The property tax in Riverside County doesn't care about family drama. It came due that spring, and I paid it. $3,200. The following fall, same thing. The gutters needed replacing. I paid for it. The back fence had a section that had come loose in a windstorm. I hired someone to fix it. When my grandfather needed the driveway resealed, I coordinated it. When the county sent a notice about a brush clearance requirement mandatory in fire risk areas with a fine if ignored, I handled it before the deadline. My grandfather and I talked every week, sometimes twice a week. He was still sharp, still funny, still the same person he'd always been. He would ask about my work, tell me about the neighbors, complain mildly about the heat. We had a rhythm. He passed in the spring of 2022, peacefully, in the house, which is what he'd wanted. And then, almost immediately, my parents wanted the property back. I understood it, on some level. Grief does strange things. The house was his. It felt like him. And I think my mother especially needed to feel like she had some claim to what remained of him. I get that. I genuinely do. But the way they went about it was something else. First, it was suggestions. You're so young. You don't need to be tied to a property like this. Then requests. It would mean so much to us, Mara. He would have wanted us to have it. Then it got sharper. You only got it because you were there and we weren't. Then my dad started saying the transfer had never been right, that my grandfather hadn't fully understood what he was signing. That last one made my stomach turn. I'd been in that room. I watched my grandfather read every page. I watched him ask 2 clarifying questions. I watched him make a small correction to one line and ask the attorney to initial it. The man knew exactly what he was signing. But my parents hired Mr. Finch, and Mr. Finch filed the claim. And suddenly I was a defendant. My attorney was a guy named Mr. Finch. Aldridge. Older, methodical, the kind of person who takes notes by hand and then types them up later because he says the physical act of writing helps him think. He was recommended to me by a colleague, and from the first meeting I trusted him. He reviewed the filing and told me the case was thin. The transfer had been properly executed. My grandfather had legal capacity. There were witnesses. The notary records were clean. He said, almost gently, that if we responded and moved for dismissal, there was a real chance this ended quickly. I thanked him and told him I wanted to take a different approach. He set down his pen. What kind of approach? I told him I was thinking about not contesting the ownership claim. Not in the way he was imagining. I wanted to let them have the property, but on paper, in a way they hadn't fully thought through. He was quiet for a long moment. Walk me through what you mean. Here's what Mr. Finch, my parents' attorney, had apparently not done. He had not read the full transfer deed, and it was a specific kind of deed, a deed with a covenant. My grandfather's attorney had included it deliberately because my grandfather had asked for it. It was a property maintenance covenant, a recorded, legally binding agreement attached to the title that required the owner to maintain the property to a defined standard, carry specific liability insurance, keep current on all property taxes, and contribute to a shared easement fund for the access road at the rear of the lot. If those obligations weren't met, the covenant allowed for enforcement by the neighboring parcel, which happened to be owned by a quiet, retired couple who had been there for 30 years and who had never needed to enforce anything because I had always been current on everything. My grandfather had included that covenant for a reason. He'd seen, up close, what happened when someone couldn't carry a property. He'd watched his own son struggle and pull back. He wanted whoever held that title after him to be someone who would actually hold it. The covenant ran with the land. It transferred to any new owner, current annual obligations under the covenant, property taxes averaging $3,400 per year, liability insurance minimum $1,200 per year, easement fund contribution $600 per year, plus documented maintenance of the structure and grounds. My parents had no idea. Neither, apparently, did Mr. Finch. I went back to Mr. Aldrich with the full picture. I laid it out. I told him I wanted to respond to the lawsuit by agreeing to a settlement, not a dismissal, not a fight, but a transfer back to my parents, executed through proper legal channels, with all title obligations disclosed in writing. He looked at me for a long time across his desk. You understand that once they have the title, your obligation ends. Yes. You understand you'll lose the property you've been carrying for 4 years. Yes. You understand that if they can't meet the covenant requirements, that's no longer your problem. I nodded. He picked up his pen again. I have to say, Mara, in 23 years of practice, I have never had a client ask me to help them lose a lawsuit on purpose. I told him I wasn't losing. I was choosing what to set down. He almost smiled. Then he got to work. The week before the hearing, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I drove out to Hemet. Not to the house. I didn't go inside, didn't want to. I just drove the neighborhood, past the scrub lot, past the driveway my grandfather had always kept swept, past the neighbor's fence with the wisteria that had been growing there since before I was born. I thought about all the Saturday mornings I'd spent on the phone with county offices, on hold with the insurance company, coordinating with contractors. I thought about the year the water bill spiked and I'd had to track down a slow leak in the irrigation line. I thought about the rush clearance notices, the gutters, the driveway seal. 4 years of small, unglamorous, necessary work. My parents thought ownership meant having the title. They always had. They thought the hard part was getting the thing. They never thought much about what came after getting it. My grandfather had. That's why he'd put the covenant in. I drove home and I slept well. The hearing was on a Tuesday. Mr. Finch came in confident. He had the original claim documents, a family history timeline, a statement from my mother about her father's cognitive state in his later years, a statement that made me press my lips together very hard and look at the wall for a moment. My grandfather had done the New York Times crossword in pen every Sunday until 6 months before he died. But okay. Mr. Aldrich presented the settlement offer. Transfer of title back to my parents, full and final, no admission of wrongdoing. All current documentation, including the recorded covenant, to be disclosed to the receiving parties and acknowledged in writing before signing. That last part was the hinge. Mr. Finch asked for a recess. In the hallway, I sat on a wooden bench and looked at a public notice board covered in flyers about jury duty and court schedules. Mr. Aldrich sat beside me and didn't say anything, which I appreciated. After 22 minutes, Mr. Finch came back out. He wanted to discuss the covenant. The look on his face was specific. It wasn't anger. It was the particular expression of someone who has realized, mid-process, that they have not done something they should have done and that this failure is now visible to everyone in the room. It was professional embarrassment, quiet and contained. He asked how long the covenant had been in place. Since the original transfer. He asked if the obligations were current. They were. I had documentation of every payment, every maintenance record, every insurance renewal going back 4 years. He asked what the annual carrying costs looked like in total when you factored in taxes, insurance, easement, and maintenance. I told him between $5,000 and $7,000 per year, minimum, before any unexpected repairs. The roof was original construction, mid-'80s. It would need replacing within the next 5 to 7 years. That was a significant cost. He asked for another recess. I said, of course. My parents were in the room. My mother sat very still. My father had his arms crossed, which was a thing he did when he was processing something he didn't want to process. My brother Scott was there too. He'd come for them, I think. Or maybe for himself. I'm not sure. I didn't look at them much, not out of coldness. I just didn't have anything left to perform. The second recess was 38 minutes. When Mr. Finch came back, he asked to speak with Mr. Aldrich privately. They stepped into a side room. I waited. The court officer near the door was looking at his phone. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. Mr. Aldrich came back 11 minutes later. He sat down beside me and said, quietly, they're withdrawing the claim. I asked if he was sure. Their attorney advised them that proceeding with the transfer, given the covenant obligations and their current financial situation, would expose them to significant ongoing liability. They're withdrawing. I nodded. Which means, he continued, the property remains yours. The claim is dropped. You're free. I said thank you. I meant it. My uncle called that evening. The same one who'd texted me the morning this all started. He'd been following things from a distance. He and my dad had a complicated relationship, and he hadn't been at the hearing, but he'd talked to someone who was. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was okay. Tired, but okay. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know your grandfather would have seen exactly what you did today." I didn't answer right away. There was a knot somewhere in my chest that had been there for months, and something in what he said loosened it, just slightly. I told him I thought my grandfather had, in some ways, already planned for it. Long before I did, my uncle laughed, a short, sad laugh. That sounds like him. It did. It really did. My mother texted me 3 days later, not about the lawsuit, not about the property. She sent a photo, one I hadn't seen before, of my grandfather at a picnic table, probably 1987, squinting into the sun and holding a hamburger and laughing at something off camera. I don't know why she sent it, she didn't explain. I didn't ask. I saved it to my phone and I've looked at it maybe a dozen times since. People ask me sometimes, when this comes up, when I tell some version of this story, whether I feel bad about how it ended, whether I feel guilty for setting things up the way I did, for letting the covenant do what it did, for walking into that hearing knowing something the other side didn't know. I think about it honestly when people ask. I don't want to give the comfortable answer just because it sounds better. Here's what I actually think. I didn't hide anything. The covenant was recorded. It was public record. Mr. Finch had access to the same title documents I did. If he had read them, if anyone on their side had spent an afternoon at the county recorder's office, they would have known everything I knew. I didn't create the situation. My grandfather created it. He created it thoughtfully, deliberately, because he understood something about ownership that I don't think my parents have ever fully understood. Ownership is not a reward. It's not something you receive because you want it, or because you feel entitled to it, or because it belonged to someone you loved. Ownership is a set of obligations. It's maintenance records and insurance renewals and brush clearance notices and easement payments and every unsexy, unglamorous responsibility that comes with holding something. My parents wanted the house because it was his. They wanted to hold something of him. I understand that. I really do. But they weren't willing to hold what came with it. And if I'd fought the lawsuit and won, they would have carried that grievance forever. I'd taken something from them. I'd beaten them in court. I was the daughter who'd lawyered up against her own family. This way, they made the choice. Their attorney told them what it would actually cost, and they decided it wasn't worth it. That wasn't me doing anything to them. That was them seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, what they'd actually been asking for. The property taxes came due in November. I paid them, same as always. The insurance renewed in January. I updated the coverage, same as always. I drove out to Hemet in the spring, first time I'd been back since before the hearing. The wisteria on the neighbor's fence was blooming again, purple and heavy. The driveway was fine. The gutters I'd had replaced 2 years ago were holding up. I sat on the back porch for a while, the one my grandfather had screened in himself decades ago. The screens were old, but they still kept the bugs out. I thought about him sitting there. I thought about all the years he'd carried this, quietly, without complaint, without needing anyone to know how much work it actually was. That's the thing about carrying something well. Nobody sees it. The maintenance records don't make the news. The insurance renewal doesn't get acknowledged at Thanksgiving dinner. You just do it year after year because you said you would. I locked up, set the alarm, and drove home. The road back was the same road it had always been. Long and flat and dry, cutting through country that doesn't ask anything of you, that just sits there under the sun doing what it does. I turned on the radio, something old, something I half remembered. I didn't change the station. I had work in the morning. I've thought a lot about what my grandfather actually gave me. Not the property, not the taxes, and the gutters and the brush clearance notices and the insurance renewals. I mean what he gave me when he sat across that table and signed his name and said, without saying it directly, "I trust you to understand what this means." He wasn't handing me an asset, he was handing me a standard. And I think about the years I spent meeting that standard, quietly, without anyone watching. The Saturday mornings on hold with the county, the spreadsheet I kept with every payment, every contractor invoice, every renewal date. Nobody saw that work. Nobody acknowledged it at Christmas or thanked me for it at the family dinners I still showed up to even when things were cold. It just existed. In records, in files, in the condition of a house that stayed standing and properly insured while life happened around it. That's the thing about integrity in the unglamorous sense. It doesn't perform. It just accumulates. When Mr. Finch finally read the full deed and understood what his clients were actually asking for, when the covenant obligations became real numbers on paper instead of an abstract desire to have something back, the case didn't collapse because I'd outmaneuvered anyone. It collapsed because reality had been there the whole time, waiting. The covenant was recorded, public record. Anyone could have found it. They simply hadn't looked, because wanting something and understanding something are not the same action, and they'd spent years doing the first one without bothering with the second. That's not a trap. That's just how accountability works when nobody's protecting you from it anymore. I think about my parents sometimes and I try to be honest with myself about what I feel. It isn't satisfaction exactly. It isn't bitterness either. I worked hard to not carry that, because bitterness is expensive and I'd already been paying enough. What I feel is something closer to clarity, a clean line between what I did and what they did, drawn not by a judge but by the facts themselves. My grandfather understood something I've been learning slowly, the hard way, through 4 years of maintenance records and one very long Tuesday in a courthouse hallway. The things worth having are worth having because of what they require from you, not in spite of it. The cost is the point. The cost is how you know it means something. Mara paid the taxes. Mara kept the records. Mara drove to Hemet on a Saturday when the brush clearance notice came due, because that's what you do when something is yours and you intend to keep it yours. And when the moment came to prove it, there was nothing to prove. The receipts were already there, years deep, doing the talking. I don't think intelligence alone gets you through something like this. You can be smart and still want things you haven't earned. What gets you through is the slower, quieter work, building the kind of record that can stand up in a room full of strangers and speak for itself. That takes time. It takes showing up when nobody's looking. It takes deciding over and over that the standard matters even when it's inconvenient, even when nobody notices, even when the people who should appreciate it are busy filing paperwork against you instead. My grandfather knew that. He built it into the deed deliberately because he'd seen up close what happened when someone carried a thing carelessly. He chose me because he believed I wouldn't. I try every day to be worth that.